Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone who joins us from around the world.
We're so glad you're here.
This is Andrew and Renee.
Welcome to the Stack series.
Today we are exploring oral knowledge systems, indigenous wisdom, and the fight for intellectual property.
It's a huge topic.
It is, and I was thinking about where we should even start, and I think it has to be with something almost everyone listening has probably experienced.
Okay.
The telephone game.
Ah, yes. In the classroom.
Exactly. You're in elementary school, you're sitting in a circle on the floor, the teacher whispers a sentence to the first kid. Something, classic like, the quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog.
Right. And it goes around the circle.
One whisper at a time. And by the time it gets back to the teacher, it's completely garbled. It's turned into, like, the sick clown box bumps over the hazy fog.
And everyone has a good laugh.
Everyone laughs, and then the teacher delivers the lesson. And the lesson is always the same.
Oral communication is unreliable.
Precisely. If you don't write it down, it degrades, it falls apart, it disappears. And that idea, it gets baked into our thinking before we're even 10 years old.
It really does. It creates this very specific, almost unconscious bias.
What's the bias?
That text is truth, that the written word is permanent and reliable, and that speech is, well, it's just rumor, it's hearsay, it's flimsy.
We grow up thinking that if a culture doesn't have shelves full of books, they don't really have a history. We look at oral traditions and we categorize them as folklore.
Or just stories. Charming, maybe interesting from a cultural perspective, but not factually reliable.
Not like a textbook or a scientific paper.
Exactly. But as we got into the research for today, it became so clear that the telephone game is actually a terrible analogy for what's really going on.
It's worse than a bad analogy. It's almost disinformation.
I think you're right, because it's a game that is literally designed to fail.
Right. It takes away all the safeguards.
All of them. In the telephone game, the transmission is one-to-one. There's no repetition, there's no rhythm or melody, and crucially, there's absolutely no correction.
If you mishear something, you just pass the mistake along.
You have to. That's the rule of the game. But what we're going to be exploring today, these oral knowledge systems, are the complete opposite of that. This isn't just casual storytelling.
No.
We're talking about a highly sophisticated, incredibly rigorous technology for storing and retrieving information. A technology humanity relied on for, tens of thousands of years before the printing press was even a concept.
And I think we need to set the stakes right here at the top. Because when you hear oral tradition, your mind might jump to myths or legends about gods and creation.
Which is part of it, of course.
But it's so much more. We are talking about survival manuals.
That's the perfect term for them. These are the hard drives of indigenous knowledge, and they contain data on everything. Medicine, law, navigation, botany, astronomy, ethics.
And the incredible irony, which we're going to get into, is that after centuries of dismissing this, modern science and modern law are now in a desperate race to catch up.
They are, because as we face these massive global crises, like climate change and biodiversity loss, we're suddenly realizing that these oral systems contain data sets. Long-term data sets that we just can't find anywhere else.
So, to help us navigate this, we've structured our conversation into 4 main parts today.
First, we're going to look at the foundations. We need to really understand the hardware here. How does oral memory actually work? How is it possible to store, say, a map of an entire continent inside a song?
Then we'll get into the active debate. This is where things get complicated and, frankly, ugly. It's the friction point between Western science and indigenous knowledge. We'll be talking about biopiracy and the clash between patents and stewardship.
After that, we'll look to the frontiers. This is what's happening right now. There's a brand new 2024 treaty from the World Intellectual Property Organization that could change everything.
But at the same time, we have this looming threat of artificial intelligence and what some are calling automated biopiracy.
And finally, we'll talk about the implications. Why the solution to our climate crisis might literally be hidden in a song, and why we might need to fundamentally redefine what we even mean by the word science.
It's a lot to cover.
It is. So let's start at the beginning.
Okay. Foundations. What we think we know versus how it actually works. There was a phrase in the source material that really stopped me in my tracks. The walking library.
It's not a metaphor. It is a very literal description of what's happening.
How so?
Well, think about how we use our brains in the modern world. We can afford to be lazy with our memory.
I don't need to remember my best friend's phone number. It's in my phone.
Exactly. You don't need to remember the capital of Bolivia because you can Google it in 2 seconds. We have offloaded our memory to the cloud, to external devices.
We treat our brains more like processing units, not storage units.
Right. But if you live in a society without writing, you don't have that luxury. You cannot offload the data. It has to be stored internally. So these cultures developed what researchers call an architecture of memory.
An architecture. So it's not just rote memorization. It has a structure, a scaffolding.
It has a very rigorous framework. Think about mnemonics. In our education system, we might use a simple one, an acronym like ROYGBIV to remember the colors of the rainbow.
Sure.
That's like the most basic entry-level version. In oral knowledge systems, information is encoded in layers of mnemonics, in rhythm, in rhyme, in repetition, in alliteration, and even in melody.
This is where the music comes in then. It's not just for artistic expression.
The art is essential, but it's also a data compression algorithm, and it's an error correction code.
Okay, unpack that. An error correction code.
Think about a song you know really well, any popular song.
Okay.
If I were singing it and I changed a single lyric in the middle, if I swapped one word for another that didn't fit the rhyme scheme or the meter, you would know instantly.
Immediately. It would just sound wrong. It would stick out.
That's the error correction code. By encoding, say, agricultural law or a complex genealogy into a song with a specific meter and a specific melody, you are protecting that data from corruption.
So if you forget a word,
the melody and the rhythm tell you that there's a hole in the data. There's a missing piece. You can't just improvise a new word because it won't fit the structure. It breaks the rhyme.
it ensures data integrity over centuries.
It does. Which brings us back to why the telephone game is so flawed. It fails because there's no verification. But in these oral systems, you have something the sources call the peer review of the circle.
I found this part of the research fascinating. It describes how elders will sit in a circle when a history is being recited. This isn't a solo performance.
No, it's a collective public act. Imagine a group of knowledge keepers. The source material calls them mnemonic pegs, which I think is a great term.
Pegs, like they hold the structure in place.
Precisely. One speaker begins the recitation. This could be a law, a history, a map. And this is a formal event. It's not casual.
Okay.
If that speaker deviates in any way, if they get a detail wrong, if they skip a verse, if they confuse a name, the other elders in the circle will correct them instantly.
So there's no room for error? You can't just make it up as you go along?
You literally cannot. The community holds you accountable. It is a collective validation process. You know, to use a modern tech analogy, it functions very much like a blockchain.
A blockchain. I was not expecting that comparison. Explain that.
Well, what is a blockchain at its core? It's a distributed ledger, right?
Right. Everyone on the network has a copy of the transaction history.
Exactly. So if one person on the network tries to alter the record, if they try to say, I have 10 Bitcoins, when they really only have 5, the rest of the network immediately rejects that transaction. It doesn't match their copies of the truth.
So no single person can corrupt the database.
The Circle of Elders is a human blockchain. The truth, the data, is distributed across multiple minds. There is no single point of failure. No single bad actor can corrupt the database.
That is a brilliant analogy. It completely flips the script on the idea of oral history being fragile.
Yeah.
It's actually incredibly robust because of that built-in redundancy.
It is. And this isn't some abstract cultural practice. It's directly linked to survival. The research highlighted a case study of the Seminame people in Bolivia that really drives this home.
Right, the study on the late life service niche.
Yes. So evolutionary biologists have always kind of puzzled over the role of the elderly in pre-modern societies.
Because from a purely physical calories in, calories out perspective, getting old seems like a liability for the group.
It does. In a physical economy, as you age, your muscle mass decreases. You can't hunt as effectively. You can't carry heavy loads. Your physical output declines. So the question is, why has evolution favored humans living so long past their reproductive and peak physical years? Why does the group continue to support you?
And the Seminame study found an answer.
It suggests the answer is this late life service niche. What the researchers found was a direct correlation. As an individual's physical strength declined with age, their information output skyrocketed.
So they contribute knowledge instead of muscle.
They become the repositories of rare but vital knowledge. The 20-year-old hunter is strong and fast. He knows how to track a tapir. But the 70-year-old elder, she remembers the great drought that happened 50 years ago.
She remembers what the community ate when all the usual food sources failed.
Precisely. She knows which obscure roots become edible only after a specific preparation. She recalls the migration patterns of animals that only appear once every few decades. That knowledge, stored in her library, is the insurance policy for the entire community.
If she hadn't stored that data, the group might not survive the next crisis.
Storytelling isn't a hobby for retirees. It is an evolutionary adaptation for survival. It's the community's backup drive.
It's incredible, and this applies not just to time to history, but to space as well, to geography.
Yes, which brings us to what I think is one of the most mind-bending examples in all the research, the Songlines of Australia.
The songlines, a lot of people have probably heard the term, but the mechanics of how it actually works are just stunning. It sounds so poetic and abstract, singing the land.
It is poetic, but it is not abstract in the slightest. It's a high-precision, land-based navigation system. It's a GPS made of music.
So walk us through it. How does a song tell you where to go?
Okay, so a songline describes a path across the landscape. These paths can be enormous, some stretching for thousands of kilometers, crossing the entire continent, linking dozens of different language groups.
Well,
And the song itself is synchronized with the physical act of walking. The rhythm of a particular verse corresponds directly to the walking pace you need to use to cross that specific piece of terrain.
wait, hold on. The tempo of the song actually matches the topography of the land.
Yes. If you're singing a verse that's slow, melodic, with a long, steady beat, it probably indicates you're on a flat, easy plain where you can stride out and cover a lot of ground.
And if it gets steep,
If the rhythm suddenly becomes choppy, fast, maybe breathless, that could be describing a steep, rocky ascent where you have to take short, quick, careful steps. The song is literally regulating your breath and your energy.
that's unbelievable. So the rhythm is the pace. What about the lyrics?
The lyrics are the visual cues. They are the waypoints. Here is the group of rocks that looks like a sleeping lizard. Turn left at the twisted ghost gum tree. Over this rise, you will find a hidden water hole.
So if you know the song, you have the map. It's encoded.
You have the map. But the philosophy behind it is even deeper. The source material brings up this concept of stars and spaces.
Stars and spaces, what does that mean?
Western navigation, like looking at a star chart or a map, tends to focus on the nodes, the stars, the landmarks, as isolated points in an empty void. We see point A and point B, and we draw a straight line between them. Indigenous philosophy, especially in Australia, is more focused on the relationship between those points. The songline isn't just a set of directions. It encodes the relationship between you, the traveler, and the land itself. It's not just where is the rock, it's how do I relate to this rock? What is its story? What is my responsibility to it?
And the most incredible practical application of this, mentioned in the research, is that it allows for navigation across territory you'd never even seen before.
That's the transferable data aspect. It's astounding. If you learn a songline from a neighboring group, maybe at a large ceremonial gathering or through trade, you can then travel through their land with complete accuracy, even if it's your first time there.
You just follow the melody.
You follow the melody and the lyrics. It's a verifiable, shareable data packet,
Mm-hmm.
but the stakes couldn't be higher.
In the Australian outback, getting lost is a death sentence.
It is dehydration exposure. If you forget a verse, or if you decide to remix the song and change the lyrics, you get lost. You die. The accuracy of the oral transmission is a literal matter of life and death.
There's no room for the telephone game, when your only source of water for 100 kilometers depends on getting the third verse right.
Exactly. It completely changes your perspective on what music is for. We think of it as entertainment, as an emotional outlet. Here, it is a critical survival tool.
And this isn't unique to Australia. Moving across the world to West Africa, we see a different version of this with the griot tradition.
Or the jelly, depending on the language and region, yes.
I think the griot is another figure that's widely misunderstood in the West. We tend to think of them as, a bard, a traveling minstrel.
Calling a griot a musician is like calling the Library of Congress a book club. It misses the point entirely.
The sources refer to them as archivists.
They're living archives. They're genealogists, historians, diplomats, legal scholars, all wrapped into one person. A griot holds the unwritten constitutions of their societies in their memory.
So they can recite lineages going back centuries.
Centuries. Births, deaths, marriages, major battles, political alliances. In many traditional West African societies, if there was a dispute over land ownership or who was the rightful heir to a title, you wouldn't consult a dusty legal text. You would summon the griot.
And the recitation of the history would be the final word. It would settle the case.
It would be the binding legal record. And they often use an instrument, the kora, which is this beautiful 21-string harp lute. And once again, the music isn't just accompaniment.
It's the bookshelf.
It's the bookshelf. It's the mnemonic structure that helps them retrieve thousands upon thousands of names, dates, and events with perfect accuracy. There's a famous saying in West Africa, when a griot dies, it is as if a library has burned down.
That's powerful. It really underscores both the fragility and the immense value placed on the individual knowledge keeper in these systems.
And it brings us to this really useful umbrella term that's used throughout the academic literature to describe all of this. Tech.
TEK, traditional ecological knowledge.
Let's define that properly because it's going to be central to the rest of our conversation.
Okay, what is tech?
The formal definition is something like a cumulative body of knowledge, practice, and belief, evolving by adaptive processes and handed down through generations by cultural transmission about the relationship of living beings with one another and with their environment.
Okay, that's a mouthful. Let me play devil's advocate for a second. How is that fundamentally different from what we call Western science? I mean, isn't data just data? If I observe that a certain plant, when applied to a cut, stops the bleeding, that's an observation, that's science, isn't it? Why do we need a special acronym?
That's a fantastic question, and it gets right to the core of the philosophical divide. Western science, for the most part, tends to be reductionist. Meaning we isolate variables to understand them. If we want to study the genetics of corn, we take a sample of the corn into a sterile lab. We control the temperature, the light, the nutrients. We separate it from the beans and the squash and the insects and the soil microbes.
We take it apart to see how it works.
We take it apart. Tech, on the other hand, is fundamentally holistic. It operates from the assumption that you cannot understand the part without understanding the whole. Everything is connected.
So you can't understand the corn without understanding the beans that grow with it.
Or the rain, or the soil, or the specific phase of the moon you planted under. And this is the part that often trips up Western scientists. You can't understand it without the ceremony you perform when you plant it.
The ceremony, right. A scientist might look at that and dismiss it as superstition. Singing to the corn doesn't affect its DNA.
But from a tech perspective, the superstition might be the very thing that ensures survival. The ceremony might encode precise astronomical knowledge about exactly when to plant for optimal yield, or it might be a social technology that ensures the whole community comes together at the right time to do the necessary labor. The culture is inseparable from the agriculture.
The source material even mentioned Simini dream interpretation as a form of tech. That one really stopped me. How could a dream be considered data? From a Western viewpoint, dreams are just, random neural noise.
But for the Simini, a dream about a certain animal spirit, for example, might be interpreted as a reliable indicator of an upcoming change in weather.
How could that possibly work?
Well, the body might be sensing subtle environmental cues that the conscious mind ignores. A slight shift in barometric pressure, a change in humidity. This data gets processed subconsciously and manifests in a dream. It becomes a reliable way to predict, say, when a particular animal herd is about to begin its migration. It's not magic in the fantasy sense, it's just a different way of processing real-world environmental data.
So we have these incredibly complex, robust, peer-reviewed, life-sustaining systems of knowledge.
We do.
And yet for centuries, Western science and Western law have largely dismissed them, ignored them, or actively tried to erase them.
Which leads us directly into our second act, the act of debate. This is where the friction is. Why is there so much conflict when these two worldviews meet?
It seems to come down to what the sources call the hierarchy of knowledge.
Yes. And at the top of that hierarchy for the last 500 years has been the written word. There has been a profound systemic bias of literacy.
If it isn't written down, it doesn't count.
Or legally, it doesn't exist. And this wasn't just an academic prejudice, it was a powerful tool of colonization. The most brutal example of this is the legal doctrine of terra nullius.
Nobody's land.
Right. When European colonizers, particularly the British in Australia, arrived, they looked around. They didn't see fences, they didn't see stone buildings, and crucially, they didn't see any written title deeds for the land.
So they declared it empty.
They declared it legally empty. Look, nobody owns this. It's free for the taking. They completely willfully ignored the fact that the land was already mapped, zoned, and owned.
The songlines were the deeds.
The songlines were the title deeds, they were the property lines and the legal statutes and the histories all sung into the landscape. But because the information was stored in the format of song and not paper, the colonizers deemed it invalid data. It wasn't law, it was just culture.
And this basic tension, this clash, gets even darker and more personal when we start talking about biopiracy.
This is where that hierarchy of knowledge becomes a direct instrument of theft. Biopiracy is, in essence, the appropriation of biological resources and the associated traditional knowledge without consent or fair compensation.
The sources listed several big examples, turmeric, the name tree, but I think the case of the Hoodia plant is a perfect illustration of the whole pattern.
The Hoodia case is the textbook example of biopiracy. So Hoodia is a succulent, it looks a bit like a cactus, and it grows in the Kalahari Desert in southern Africa.
Okay.
For millennia, the San people, who are one of the oldest continuous cultures on Earth, have used this plant. Their hunters would chew on it during long hunting expeditions.
For what reason?
It's a powerful appetite and thirst suppressant. If you're tracking an antelope for 3 days across the desert, you can't exactly stop for a lunch break. Chewing Hoodia allows you to push through your body's normal limits. It's critical survival knowledge.
Okay, so then Western science gets involved.
Right. In the 1960s and 70s, a South African Scientific Council, the CSIR, started studying the plant based on this traditional use. They eventually isolated the specific active molecule that causes the appetite suppression. They called it P57.
And a light bulb goes on. We've just found a miracle cure for obesity.
A multi-billion-dollar light bulb. In a world obsessed with weight loss, a natural organic appetite suppressant is a holy grail. So the CSIR patented the molecule in 1996. They then licensed it to a British biotech company, which then sub-licensed it to the pharmaceutical giant Pfizer for a deal worth millions and millions of dollars.
And the San people, who had been using this plant for thousands of years, what did they get?
Nothing. They were completely cut out of the equation. The scientists argued that they discovered the active molecule.
Which is that discovery myth all over again.
Yeah.
The headline is always, science confirms ancient remedy works.
Exactly. The community already confirmed it worked by, not starving to death in the desert for 3,000 years.
The San people eventually found out about this patent and threatened a massive international lawsuit, right?
They did. Their argument was simple. You stole our knowledge. The CSIR's counter-argument was also simple, and it's the classic defense in these cases. No, we did the science. You knew the plant worked. But we're the ones who put on the white lab coats. We isolated the specific molecule. We did the clinical trials. That's the invention.
Okay, to be fair here, didn't the scientists add value? Isolating a molecule is complex work. You can't just ship a raw cactus to a pharmacy in New York.
Oh, they absolutely added value. No one disputes that. The question is one of origin and equity. Could they have ever found that specific molecule without the roadmap provided by the San?
Probably not, or it would have taken decades.
Finding a medically active compound in nature is like finding a needle in a continent-sized haystack. The San walked up to the scientist, pointed to one single piece of hay, and said, "The needle's in there." They provided the R&D shortcut worth millions.
And in the end, after a lot of public pressure, a benefit-sharing agreement was reached.
It was. But it highlights the fundamental clash of legal systems. Western patent law says you can own an idea if it's new and useful, but many indigenous legal systems view this very differently. You don't own a song or a plant secret. You have a custodial relationship. You are the guardian, the steward of that knowledge, not the patent holder.
This feels like the central conflict. How do we get these two systems to stop fighting and start working together?
Well, that's the big question. And we are starting to see some really interesting frameworks for reconciliation emerge.
I really like the one called two-eyed seeing.
Etsuapmunk. It's a concept from the Micmac elder Albert Marshall. The idea is to learn to see from one eye with the strengths of indigenous ways of knowing, and from the other eye with the strengths of Western ways of knowing.
And to use both eyes together for a fuller picture.
Exactly. It's an acknowledgement that both systems have blind spots on their own. Western science is brilliant at understanding the micro, the molecule, the gene, the specific mechanism. Indigenous knowledge is brilliant at understanding the macro, the ecosystem, the long-term patterns, the relationships. You need both.
There was another framework, an agricultural metaphor that I found really beautiful, the Three Sisters framework.
Yes. This comes from the Haudenosaunee tradition of companion planting. You plant corn, beans, and squash together in the same mound because they help each other grow.
And that's a metaphor for knowledge systems.
It's a perfect metaphor. So in this framework, the corn represents traditional knowledge
Live corn.
because the corn grows tall and straight and strong. It provides the central stalk, it provides the structure and the support for the whole system.
Okay, so tradition is the structure. What are the beans?
The beans represent Western science. Beans are nitrogen fixers. They pull nutrients from the air and enrich the soil. They provide the fuel. But beans are vines. On their own, they're kind of floppy. They need something to climb on. If you plant beans by themselves, they just sprawl on the ground and rot.
So science needs the structure of traditional knowledge, the context, the history, to climb towards the sun.
Precisely. And then you have the third sister, the squash.
What does a squash do?
The squash has these huge, broad leaves that spread out around the base of the mound. They shade the soil, which keeps moisture in and, very importantly, prevents weeds from growing. The squash represents the ethical habitat. It's the ethical framework that protects the entire system from outside threats.
Wow, that's such a powerful image. If you just have science the beans without the structure of tradition or the protection of ethics, you end up with a mess.
You get an unsustainable, unhealthy crop. We need the nutrients of science, but we need the structure of wisdom and the protection of ethics to make it work.
Which brings us to the frontiers. Because right now, as we speak, the legal and technological ground is shifting. We are in a brand new phase of this conversation.
We absolutely are. And there are two massive forces pulling in opposite directions. On one side, we have a landmark legal achievement. On the other, a new technological threat that could make all of that progress irrelevant.
Let's start with the positive news. The WIPO 2024 Treaty. WITO is the World Intellectual Property Organization. They have been debating this for literally 20 years. What finally happened?
It's a truly historic moment. In May of 2024, they adopted the WIPO Treaty on Intellectual Property, Genetic Resources, and Associated Traditional Knowledge. And for the very first time in international law, it establishes a mandatory disclosure requirement.
Disclosure requirement. Unpack that legal term for us. What does it actually force a company to do?
Okay, so before this treaty, if you were a cosmetic company and you filed a patent for a new anti-aging cream made from a berry you found in the Amazon, you did not have to tell the patent office where you got that berry or how you learned of its properties.
You could completely erase the source.
You could, and they did. The new treaty says, if your invention is based on genetic resources like a plant, or on associated traditional knowledge like a healer's recipe for using that plant, you must disclose the country of origin or the specific indigenous community that provides the knowledge.
That just seems like basic academic honesty. You have to cite your sources. Why on earth was that so controversial?
Because patents are worth billions and billions of dollars. The big pharmaceutical and cosmetic industry players, mostly in the global north, the US, Europe, Japan, they fought this for 2 decades.
What?
They argued it would create legal uncertainty and stifle innovation. They were afraid that if they had to admit where they got their ideas, they would be forced into lengthy negotiations or have their patents challenged and revoked.
They wanted to keep the free-for-all going.
They wanted to maintain a status quo that allowed for easy, uncompensated extraction. It was the global south, the countries rich in biodiversity but often poorer in capital, that pushed relentlessly for this treaty to stop the theft.
That's a huge win then.
It is a massive step forward. It introduces transparency where there was once total obscurity. But
I knew there was a but coming.
there's always a but in international treaties. The sources we looked at are quick to point out a pretty significant loophole. The treaty is a transparency tool, but it's not necessarily a theft prevention tool.
What's the difference?
It forces you to say where you got the knowledge, it forces disclosure, but it doesn't necessarily force you to prove that you had prior informed consent or that you have a fair benefit sharing agreement in place.
Wait a second. So I can file a patent and say, I got this knowledge from the Yanomami people, and the patent office just says, okay, thanks for letting us know, and approves my patent, even if I never spoke to them or paid them.
That is the fear. The treaty largely leaves the consequences of that disclosure up to the national laws of each country. It's a notification system, it creates a paper trail that can be used later, and it might shame companies into doing the right thing, but it doesn't have the international legal teeth to block a patent based on a lack of consent.
So it's a start, but it's not a silver bullet.
Not yet. And here's the frightening part. Just as we are finally starting to close the door on physical biopiracy, a massive new digital window is being thrown wide open.
And this is where AI comes in. The phrase from the notes, automated biopiracy, is genuinely chilling. How would that work?
Imagine you're a researcher at a big pharma company in 2025. You don't want to deal with the hassle of the new WIPO treaty. You don't want to fly to the Amazon. You don't want to hire translators. You don't want to negotiate with a whole community.
Too much red tape, too much risk.
Exactly. So you stay in your lab in Geneva. You fire up a new AI model. Let's call it AnthropoGPT. This AI has been trained on a massive data set of every digitized anthropological text, every missionary's journal from the 1800s, every scanned ethnobotany book from the last 2 centuries.
So it can read all the old records about traditional medicine.
It can mine them for patterns at a scale no human ever could. The AI scans millions of pages and finds a correlation. It notices that in, say, 85% of texts describing cultures in the Andes Mountains, a specific lichen is mentioned in the context of treating lung ailments.
The AI has identified a promising target.
It has the lead. Then the AI cross-references this with a public biological database like GenBank, which contains the genetic sequences of millions of organisms. This is called digital sequence information, or DSI.
So it looks up the plant's DNA online.
Exactly. The AI analyzes the genetic code of that lichen, predicts the protein structures it would produce, and models which one is most likely to act as a powerful anti-inflammatory in human lungs. It designs the drug for you.
And then you just synthesize that molecule in the lab and file for a patent.
And you've done it without ever touching the physical plant. You never spoke to a single person from that culture. You discovered a new drug using nothing but publicly available digital data.
That is terrifyingly efficient. It completely bypasses the physical world.
It bypasses the WIPO treaty, which is focused on physical genetic resources. You didn't use the resource, you used the information about the resource.
Yeah.
And right now, the legal status of DSI is a huge, messy gray area.
The knowledge is just teleported out of the culture, completely stripped of its context and its people.
Which is why there is now a huge global push for what's called indigenous data sovereignty.
What does that mean?
The principle is that indigenous peoples must have control over data about them, their resources, and their knowledge, not just the physical land they live on. They have to have a say in how this data is collected, used, and who benefits from it.
But this creates a huge dilemma, doesn't it? If digitizing everything and putting it online is the weapon that allows AI to steal it, then should we just stop? Shouldn't we be trying to record and preserve all this knowledge before the last speakers of a language pass away?
This is the central paradox of our time. Digital preservation versus sacred secrecy. If you upload a sacred ceremony to YouTube to save it, have you actually preserved it? Or have you destroyed the very protocols that gave it meaning in the first place?
Because, as we said, some knowledge is restricted.
It is. Some stories are only meant to be told by women. Some songs are only for the winter season. Some knowledge is reserved for those who have gone through a specific initiation. If you just dump it all on the open internet, available to anyone with a Wi-Fi connection, you have preserved the digital file, but you have desecrated the knowledge.
So how do you digitize a secret? It seems like a contradiction in terms.
It requires building new kinds of tools. The research points to a fascinating platform called Mukurtu.
Mukurtu.
It's basically a content management system, like a WordPress for cultural heritage, but it was built from the ground up by and for indigenous communities to respect their cultural protocols.
How does it do that?
It allows for incredibly granular access controls. You can upload a recording of a story and apply digital tags that mirror the real-world rules. This story can only be viewed by members of this specific clan. This song can only be played during the winter months.
So if I try to access the file in July, it just won't open.
It will be locked. It embeds the cultural law directly into the software's code.
That's incredible.
But the most powerful feature, I think, is what they call the round trip.
The round trip.
Think about all the major museums in London or Paris or Washington, D.C. They have archives full of photos and audio recordings made 100 years ago in indigenous communities. But the metadata is often terrible. It just says, audio recording, Amazon, 1952, speaker, unknown.
It's useless contextually.
Right. Mukurtu allows the museum to send that digital file back to the source community. It's a form of digital repatriation. The community members can then listen to the recording, and an elder might say, wait, I know that voice. That's my great-grandmother singing the harvest song. They can correct the historical record. They can add the proper context. And then, most importantly, they get to set the permissions.
So they decide if that song is made public or if it stays within the community.
It gives the agency and control back to the source. It turns the colonial archive from a mausoleum into a living, breathing resource.
And speaking of living resources, all of this is built on the foundation of language. If the language disappears, the knowledge becomes almost inaccessible.
It does. The language is the operating system for the entire knowledge base, which is why language revitalization is such a critical frontier.
The sources highlighted a major success story here from New Zealand, the language nests.
Tiku Shangareo, yes. This was a revolutionary movement in education. Back in the 1980s, the Maori people realized their language was critically endangered. The conventional school system, teaching Maori as a subject for a few hours a week, wasn't working.
It creates students who can pass a vocabulary test, but not people who can think and dream in the language.
Exactly. So they threw that model out. They created these nests, immersion-based childcare centers for children from birth to age 6. And the one unbreakable rule is only Maori is spoken.
Total immersion from day one.
The grandmothers, the kuya, speak only Maori to the babies. They feed them in Maori, they sing to them in Maori, they comfort them in Maori. The core idea is simple but profound. You don't teach a language. You create an environment where the language lives and breathes.
And the logic is that the entire worldview is baked right into the grammar of the language.
Absolutely. Think about the difference between a language where the default way to express your relationship to land is to say, I own this land, versus a language where the grammar forces you to say, I belong to this land. Those are two completely different philosophies. Saving the language saves the worldview.
Which brings us perfectly to our final act today, the implications. We've talked about the history, the law, the technology. But let's bring it home. Why does any of this matter to someone listening to this in a city completely disconnected from these traditions? What is the so what?
The so what is that the planet is in a state of emergency. That sounds dramatic, but it's the simple truth. And the people who hold the knowledge we've been discussing, they happen to be the stewards of the only parts of the planet that aren't yet completely degraded.
The statistic from the research is just staggering. Indigenous peoples make up less than 6% of the world's population.
But they protect and manage over 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity. That is not a coincidence. That is a direct correlation. Where you find functioning indigenous knowledge systems, you find ecological health.
The source material used the example of the flying rivers of the Amazon.
It's a perfect example of a deep, systemic ecological understanding. Indigenous groups in the Amazon have known for millennia that the forest isn't just a collection of trees, it's a giant hydrological pump.
What pump?
The trees collectively release trillions of gallons of water vapor into the atmosphere through transpiration. This creates massive, invisible rivers of moisture in the sky that flow across the continent and deliver the rain that waters the agricultural heartlands of Brazil and Argentina.
So if you cut down the forest to plant soybeans,
You break the pump, the flying rivers dry up, the rains fail hundreds of miles away, the soybean crops wither. The indigenous understanding of this continental water cycle, managed through their tech, is far more sophisticated than the short-term extractive model of industrial agriculture.
so we have to see this knowledge not just as something to preserve for cultural reasons, but as a critical source of R&D for our own survival.
We cannot solve the climate crisis using the same reductionist extractive mindset that created it. We desperately need the long-term holistic data set that tech provides.
It also forces us to challenge our very definition of science, doesn't it? We tend to place science with a capital S on this pedestal as the one and only path to truth.
But if you define science at its most basic level as a process of observation, experimentation, and prediction, then an elder in the Andes who knows exactly which combination of leaves will cure a specific respiratory illness. She is a scientist.
Her lab is the forest.
And her methodology has been peer-reviewed and replicated for thousands of years. If the formula didn't work, her ancestors would have stopped using it centuries ago. She is standing on the shoulders of an immense body of empirical data.
It shifts the frame. It's not folklore. It's highly refined long-term data.
Exactly.
And finally, there's a social implication here for all of us. We live in a world that feels increasingly disconnected, isolated, lonely. We have access to infinite information on our phones, but rates of alienation are higher than ever.
Oral traditions have a magic ingredient that digital information lacks. Presence.
Presence.
You have to be there. You have to sit in the circle. You have to breathe the same air as the storyteller. You have to feel the rhythm in your body. You can't multitask. You can't speed read a songline at 2 times speed. In our fragmented digital world, the ancient technology of sitting together in a circle and truly listening might be one of the most powerful medicines we have for our modern social ills.
There's a quote from an indigenous leader in the source material that stuck with me. We are not only protecting nature, we are nature itself.
That's the paradigm shift at the heart of all these systems. We are not separate observers looking at the world through a window. We are active relational participants within it.
So as we come to the end of this conversation, what's the final thought we should leave with? We've covered the architecture of memory, the biopiracy debate, the threat of AI, the climate stakes. Where do we go from here?
I want to leave you with one final distinction to think about. It's the difference between the archive and the repertoire.
Okay. The archive versus the repertoire.
An archive, like a library, a museum, a server farm, is designed to be safe. It's stable. You can lock the door and preserve a file for 1,000 years. But in a way, it's dead. A book on a shelf isn't doing anything. A song stored as an MP3 file. If no one ever plays it, does it still have power?
It's just dormant data.
A repertoire, on the other hand, the oral tradition, is fragile. It lives in the human body. It exists in the breath, the throat, the memory. If the singer dies, the song is endangered. But it is profoundly alive. It breathes, it adapts, it responds to the audience and the moment.
So what should our goal be?
I think we need to be very careful. Our goal shouldn't just be to save the files. We can't just run around with recorders, upload all this indigenous knowledge to the cloud, and then pat ourselves on the back for creating a massive digital archive.
Because that just turns a living thing into a museum exhibit.
Precisely. The goal must be to support the repertoire, to keep the people, the languages, and the practices alive and thriving. Because a song that is still being sung as a map that can lead you home, a song that's just a file in an archive, is just a memory of a map.
Before we wrap up, thank you to all our partners, sponsors, and scholars who made this podcast and the research possible. We're truly grateful for your support.
And to our listeners, thank you for being part of this journey with us. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe and follow Stack Studios for more informative content and support us on Patreon.
Until next time, stay curious, keep learning, and let the search for wisdom guide you forward. Have a great day.